I want to tell you about a very strange contest that is held every spring in New York City called the United States Memory Championship. And I had gone a few years back to cover this contest as a science journalist, expecting, I guess, to find the Super Bowl of savants. This was a bunch of guys and a few girls, widely varying in both age and degree of hygienic upkeep, who were memorizing long strings of random numbers. They were memorizing the names of dozens and dozens and dozens of strangers. They were memorizing long poems. They were even memorizing entire shuffled packs of playing cards. And I was like, these people must be freaks of nature. This is unbelievable. And I started talking to some of the competitors. This is a guy named Ed Cook, who had come from England, where he had one of the best memories in all of Europe, as sort of a spring training for that year's World Championship. I started talking to him and I said, Ed, when did you realize that you were a savant? And he was like, I'm not a savant. In fact, I don't even have such a great natural memory. None of the people who compete in this contest, he told me, have exceptional natural memories. We've all learned to do this, to perform these utterly miraculous feats through technique and training. And I was like, that's amazing. We were outside the competition hall. He was smoking a cigarette. And he said to me, you're a journalist. Do you know Britney Spears? I was like, what? No, why? Because I really want to teach Britney Spears how to memorize the order of a shuffled pack of playing cards on U.S. national television. It'll prove to the world that anybody can do this. I was like, well, I don't know Britney Spears, but maybe you could teach me. I mean, you got to start somewhere. And that was the beginning of a very strange journey for me. I ended up spending the better part of the next year not only trying to train my memory, but also to investigate it, to understand what it is and how it works, and why it sometimes doesn't work, and what its potential might be. And along the way, I met a host of really incredible characters, including a guy called E.P., who had probably the worst memory in the world. His memory was so bad that he didn't even remember that he had a memory problem, which is kind of amazing. I spent time with a guy called Kim Peek, who was the basis for Dustin Hoffman's character in the movie Rain Man. We spent an afternoon together in the Salt Lake City Public Library memorizing phone books, which was scintillating. And I went back and I read a number of the memory treatises, the treatises on memory training that had been written in antiquity and in the Middle Ages, and I learned a lot of really interesting stuff. One of the really interesting things that I learned is that once upon a time, this idea of having a trained, disciplined, cultivated memory was not nearly so alien an idea as it would seem to us to be today. Once upon a time, people invested in their memories, in laboriously furnishing their minds. They had to. Over the last few millennia, we've invented a series of technologies, starting, I suppose, with the alphabet, continuing through the scroll, the codex, the printed book, the photograph, the computer, Google, smartphones, that have made it easier and easier for us to externalize our memories, for us to outsource this fundamental human capacity. It's changed us. It's changed us culturally, for sure, these technologies. I would argue they've also changed us cognitively. Having no need to remember anymore, it sometimes seems like we've forgotten how. One of the last places where you still find people passionate about this idea of a disciplined, cultivated, trained memory is at this totally singular contest called the U.S. Memory Championships. It's not that singular. There are contests all over the world in about a dozen countries. And I wanted to know, how do these guys do it? Do they have photographic memory? I want to do a little test here. I'd like everybody to cover your left eye and look up at the screen. And I want you to commit that image to memory with your right eye. Really try and remember it, okay? Now I want you to switch eyes, cover the other eye, and look at this image, and try and commit it to memory. Okay. Now, what I'd like you to do is, I don't know if you remember those random dot stereograms that were kind of popular in the 1990s. They were sort of a fad. You could find them in shopping malls, where you'd cross your eyes, and the two random dots would produce a new image that would sort of pop out at you. I'd like you to do that in your mind's eye. I suspect that nobody in this room can do that. There is a woman called Elizabeth who supposedly could. She was the subject of a paper that was published in the journal Nature in 1970, the first person who had ever been found with a photographic memory. Scientists went out looking for other people with photographic memories, this ability to take a snapshot with their mind's eye. They put ads in newspapers all over the world, and they were never able to find another case of somebody with a photographic memory. Most psychologists now doubt this particular study. The paper has never been retracted, but there's all sorts of weird stuff about it. The scientist ended up marrying Elizabeth. She was never tested again. Anyways, most of us now doubt that there is such a thing as photographic memory. So if it's not photographic memory, what is going on in these mental athletes' minds, in the minds of these memory champions? Well, a few years back, a group of scientists at University College London brought a bunch of these memory champions into the lab, and they wanted to know, are these people somehow smarter than the rest of us? They gave them a whole bunch of cognitive tests. The answer was, basically, no. Do they somehow have brains that are different? Are their brains structurally, anatomically different from the rest of ours? The answer was no. They did find one really interesting and telling difference between the memory champions and the control subjects that they compared them to. When they put the memory champions in an fMRI machine and asked them to memorize strings of random numbers, people's faces, they would give them a lot of snowflakes, different looking snowflakes in order to memorize, they found that the memory champions were activating different regions of their brain than the control subjects. They didn't have different brains, they were just using them differently. In particular, of note is the fact that they were activating regions of the brain associated with spatial memory and navigation. This would seem to be weird. Why would these people who are laying in an MRI chamber, having their brain scanned, memorizing random numbers, be using the same part of the brain that they would be using if they were driving their car around the neighborhood? Well, the entire sport of competitive memorizing is driven by a kind of arms race, where every year somebody comes up with some new way to remember more stuff more quickly. Usually it's one of the competitors who's temporarily unemployed or a student who has an unstructured summer vacation. This is Ben Pridmore, the 3-time world memory champion. He's got 36 shuffled packs of playing cards laying out on the table in front of him. He's about to try to memorize the order of all of them perfectly, using a technique that he invented and which nobody else has yet mastered. Ben used a similar technique to memorize the precise order of 4,140 random binary digits in half an hour. That's amazing. And keep in mind, he did that this is not like some innate talent that he has. This is something he developed through training and technique. And while there are myriad ways of remembering lots and lots of information, all of the techniques that are used in these memory contests ultimately come down to a fundamental principle that psychologists refer to as elaborative encoding. And it's a principle that's nicely demonstrated by a nifty paradox called the Baker-Baker paradox. It goes like this. If I tell two people to remember the same word, I say to one, remember that there is a guy named Baker. Like that's his name, capital B Baker. And I say to somebody else, remember that there is a guy who is a baker. Like that's his job. And I come back to these two people at some later date, and I say, you remember I had asked you to memorize that word or learn that word? Do you remember what it was? The person who was told his name is Baker is less likely to remember that same word as the person who was told this guy's job is that he is a baker. That's weird. It's the same word, different amount of remembering. What is going on here? Well, the name Baker doesn't actually mean anything to you. It is entirely untethered from all of the other memories floating around in your skull. The common noun baker, lowercase b baker, well, we know bakers. Bakers wear funny white hats. Bakers have flour on their hands. Bakers smell good when they come home from work. Maybe we even know a baker. And so when we hear that word, all of these associations are immediately hooked into it that help make that word more memorable. The entire art of what is going on in these memory contests, and indeed the entire art of remembering stuff better in everyday life, is figuring out how to transform capital B bakers into lowercase b bakers. How do you take information that has no context, that has no meaning, no significance, and transform it in some way so that it can be integrated into the network of other things that you know about? One of the more elaborate techniques, one of the more elaborate and artificial techniques for turning capital B bakers into lowercase b bakers goes back 2,500 years to a Greek poet named Simonides. And the story is, as it's been handed down to us by Cicero, it's probably a legend, is that Simonides was attending a banquet. Because back then, if you wanted to throw a really slammin' party, you didn't hire a DJ, you didn't hire a band, you hired a poet. And Simonides stands up, delivers his ode, from memory, of course, leaves the banquet hall, and at the moment he does, its roof collapses. Kills everybody inside. Doesn't just kill everybody, it mangles the bodies beyond all recognition, such that nobody can say who was sitting where, who had been inside. None of the bodies could be properly buried. Simonides, the sole survivor, standing outside the banquet hall, amid the rubble, closes his eyes and has this realization, which is that in his mind's eye, he can see where each of the guests at the banquet had been sitting. And what he figured out at that moment is something that I think we all kind of intuitively know, which is that as bad as we are at remembering phone numbers and the names of strangers and word-for-word instructions from our bosses, we have very good visual and spatial memories. So if you were to, for example, come visit my apartment in New Haven, Connecticut, and if you were the kind of nosy person who opened up all the doors and went into the bathroom, looked in the medicine cabinet, checked the fridge to see if the milk smelled good, you would walk out of my apartment after just a few minutes being able to remember where my fridge was, where my stove was, where my sofa was, the giant stuffed bird that was given to me as a gift hangs on the wall. We don't think of that as a feat of memory, but it's actually a lot of information. And what Simonides realized was, what if instead of remembering where the sofa, stove, fridge, and bird were, what if instead you saw images in your apartment of things that you actually cared to remember? Well, then you would remember that information instead. And out of this discovery, this invention, came a technique that came to be known as the memory palace. This is the same technique that Cicero used to memorize the speeches that he delivered on the floor of the Roman Senate, that medieval scholars used to memorize entire books. Let me show you how it works. Let's say you're invited to La Ciudad de las Ideas, and you have to give a speech from memory. What you might do is picture yourself at the front door of your house. And you'd want to come up with some sort of an image that would remind you of the first topic that you were going to talk about. In this case, this totally bizarre contest that's held every spring in New York City. So you'd create an image. The more bizarre, the weirder, the stinkier, the raunchier, the funnier, the stranger, the more unusual, the better. This is advice that goes back at least 2,000 years to the earliest memory treatises written in Latin. So to remind you of the first thing you wanted to talk about, maybe you'd see an image of a bizarre contest. Maybe a naked bicycle race. And that would remind you of the first thing you wanted to talk about. And then you'd walk inside your house, into your foyer. This is most definitely not my house. This is not Foer's foyer. And you would see an image of the second subject that you were going to talk about in your speech. In this case, this funny story about Britney Spears. And then you'd go into the next room of your house, maybe it's the kitchen, and you'd see an image that would remind you of the third topic that you wanted to talk about. In this case, this strange journey that you went on, and you would have some friends to help you remember that. So, the phrase topic sentence topic comes from topos, the Greek word for place. That is a vestige of when people used to think about oratory in these terms. Another phrase, in the first place. In the first place, that's like in the first place of your memory palace. I thought this was all really fascinating, and I thought I was going to write something longer about this whole world of competitive memorizing and the science and the history behind it, but there was a problem. I went to a number of these contests as a journalist, and the problem was a memory contest is a pathologically boring event. It is literally like a bunch of people sitting around taking the SATs. The most exciting it gets is when somebody, starts dramatically massaging their temples. And I'm a journalist, I'm sitting there like, I know there's interesting things happening in your mind, but you gotta give me something to work with here. And I realized if I wanted to tell this story, I was gonna have to walk in their shoes a little bit. And so I ended up trying to develop some of the skills that these mental athletes had developed. Every morning, I would wake up and I'd spend 15, maybe 20 minutes between when I sort of had my cup of coffee and sat down with the New York Times, just trying to memorize something. Maybe it was a poem, maybe I'd take an old yearbook and try and remember the people's names in it. And over time, I kind of got better and better at this. And I thought, you know what? If I'm going to write this longer piece about this world of competitive memorizing, maybe I'll go back and compete in the same contest that I'd covered a year before. It'd make a nice afterword. And so I went back and entered this contest sort of as an experiment in participatory journalism. The problem was I won, which really wasn't supposed to happen. Not only did I win, I actually set a new US record by memorizing a pack of playing cards in 1 minute and 40 seconds, which may sound impressive, but is actually totally unimpressive by the standards of the international memory community, where the top time for memorizing a pack of playing cards is 21.9 seconds. Americans on the international memory circuit were sort of like Jamaican bobsledders on the international bobsledding circuit. I think it's fair to say that we are the coolest folks at any contest, but we perpetually get our tushes handed to us by just about everybody else. So now, in this very strange position of having come at this as a journalist, I was now the official representative of the United States of America, with the hopes and dreams of 290 million citizens resting not lightly on my shoulders, to the World Memory Championships, which were held that year in London. And I was like, all right, I gotta take this seriously. And if you're gonna take the sport of competitive memorizing seriously, you need equipment. Everybody who competes at the highest level wears earmuffs, because you can never be deaf enough in a memory contest. If you're really into it, and it's almost exclusively the Germans take this so seriously. Something about this sport just like speaks to the Teutonic soul. They wear these blinders that are just like masked over except for 2 small pinholes so they can only look at what's directly in front of them. And so I came to the World Memory Championships with my earmuffs that had been painted with the stars and stripes so everybody would know who the Yankee in the room was. And I wanted to do Uncle Sam proud, but I am sorry to report that I gave the world an entirely unimpressive impression of American collective memory. I got whooped by the Germans, the Brits, the Malaysians, but I am exceedingly proud to tell you that I beat the crap out of the French guy. Thank you very much.